Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first in a series of webinars brought to you by the UK Universities Purchasing Consortium. UK UPC is a partnership between 6 regional purchasing consortia, along with the Energy Consortium and the University Caterers Organisation. UK UPC collaboratively provide frameworks and other procurement support to help you, our members, achieve best value through your procurement activity. Part of our role is to facilitate and share knowledge across the sector, and I'm really pleased, therefore, to confirm that further webinars will take place every other month throughout the coming year, the next being in November on the topic of equality, diversity and inclusion in procurement. So today we're going to talk all about cyber and data security, and I'm going to hand over to our fantastic panel to introduce themselves and we'll get started. So Steve, if I can come to you.
Thank you, Emma. Good morning, all. My name's Steve Kennett. I'm the Executive Director for Infrastructure at JISC. I'm also the Senior Information Risk Owner. So within JISC, my directorate is responsible for providing the Janet network, our cloud offerings, including cloud security. I'm responsible for corporate infrastructure, a very specialist training group, but more importantly for today, our cybersecurity protection and offering. And we do 3 things. We protect the Janet network, we protect our members, and I help our members protect themselves. Just to make this into context for today, on average, we see around 5,000 types of attack hitting the academic sector per year. And recently in 2020, we saw 15 universities impacted by ransomware. And in the start of this year, we saw 13 impacted in the first 4 months, and the total stands at over 30. So that's part of the reason why we're here today, is to help you understand the threats and risks. And I would like to make one point that cybersecurity is not just an IT function. Thank you, Emma.
Thanks, Steve. James Rockcliffe.
Good morning, Emma. Good morning, everybody. My name's James Rockcliffe. I'm the Director of Procurement Services at London South Bank University. We experienced a cyber incident in December 2020, and I'm here to explain how that felt, outline our response to it, and to give you a rough idea of where we are now.
Thank you, James, and over to you, Phil.
Morning, Emma. Morning, everyone. So I'm Phil Webster. I head up the education practice within Gallagher's. We're a team within the public sector and education division, and I sit as account director across all of our higher education institutions, including the contract that we hold for London Universities Purchasing Consortium, LUPC, and the insurance group there. But we also act for a number of institutions outside of that contract as well. Gallagher are an insurance broker. So what we do is we help our clients compliantly procure, administer and manage their insurance and risk management program. And within that context, we've seen a big increase in the rise of cyber and data protection insurance policies.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Phil. So as James said, he's going to take you through his experience of a cyber attack shortly. But before we go there, I want to just ask in the chat, if you can open your chat facility, I've posed a question there. What do you think the most significant and immediate impact is on an organisation if through a cyber attack systems go down? So what do you think needs to happen? Where does your focus need to be? If you can comment in the chat, which I hope you can, and let us know what you think. I'm just double checking actually that, okay, payroll, great, thanks Helen. Any other thoughts? GDPR, yep, ITOR. Communications, restricting access to key operational systems, financial risk, yep. James, do you want to, just with those comments in there, start us off with what your experience was?
Yeah, certainly. And it's good to see all of these comments coming in. But I must say, Helen Baker is on my wavelength. First comment, payroll. Absolutely spot on. And regardless of what your business continuity plan says, as soon as something like this affects an organisation, particularly a university, whereas you might think students, you might think student systems are the first thing that we need to consider, it's payroll. And our experience, I'll go through in a second. But just to give you a quick overview of where we are 9 months after our cyber attack took place. So mid-December, last year. It's quite difficult to think that far back, given what's happened in the wider world. But just to remind you, Brexit even then was a thing of the past, practically. It was, in hindsight, I consider it the sunny uplands of the last couple of years professionally. COVID was really kicking in. We were all working from home, and we'd pretty much got used to working in a very different way very quickly. And mid-December, all of our systems went offline. That took place on a Saturday evening. So that in itself presented its own challenges, and I'm sure Steve will talk about trends and patterns later. Weekend attacks are not uncommon. So just to cover the practical impact, our student systems went down. So that is no submission of projects online, no VLE, no student comms, no intranet for staff trying to communicate with our student community, no staff services, so no learning, no tracking of annual leave, no way or immediately obvious way of communicating with people. That was the immediate impact. On the business side, can't pay invoices, can't raise purchase orders. It becomes extremely difficult to accept payment from students. So practically everything ground to a halt overnight. And that was a situation that our leadership team found themselves having to deal with over the weekend and the beginning of the following week. Our response to that started off quite openly, as you would imagine, fairly chaotically. It was, right, okay, how do we even discuss this in a measured way? Who needs to discuss it? Are the business continuity plans going to really help us in this regard, or are they just going to be documents that existed and bear no relation to reality now that we're in a live incident? We were in the position at Southbank where we had bought a cyber insurance policy. And that is, often a business decision. It's usually something that is not automatically part of the annual suite of policies that your either procurement or insurance teams will organise for you and run past the CFO. And it's a decision that is revisited or has been revisited at Southbank annually. And for various different reasons, we had only decided to invest last year. So a few months ahead of when the attack actually took place. And again, just to be completely useful and helpful, that policy cost in the region of £50,000. And that covered incident response. So I referred to a slight lack of coordination and a bit of a panic when we first realised this hit. That was diluted significantly because we had a cyber policy and we contacted the insurers instantly, who arranged an incident responder. Now, an incident responder is a supplier who do lots of complicated and very difficult things I still couldn't explain to you in a way that made a great deal of sense, but they essentially handle your technology response. They come in instantly, they work with your CIO or head of IT, and they coordinate the containment, the analysis, and suggest a way forward. Now, that process happens instantly because you have a cyber insurance policy. There's no sourcing for your procurement teams to do there. It's nominated by your insurer. So we were given an insurer straight away. Had that not been the case, then we would have had to have gone to market. Now, that wouldn't have been 3 quotes. It would have been, who's going to do this now? But of course, there's no due diligence that's easy to do in that circumstance. It's far easier just to use the incident responder chosen by the insurer. That not only expedited our response, but it gave the organisation a sense of purpose quite early on, and it gave us a degree of assurance that things were being coordinated. We sourced that policy through the LUPC brokerage still, and Gallagher's were very, very helpful during that period. The actual procurement response, I mentioned during my intro, I'm a director of procurement. Obviously, I see everything through the eyes of contracting, supplier relationships and commercial relationships. And it doesn't matter how much work you've done to form really good relations with suppliers, you take away the possibility of them being paid, and that dynamic changes pretty quick. So one of the things we did inside the first week of the incident was to categorize our critical contracts. We had some building work going on. Those of you that know South Bank know we've got a very large campus at London Road, halfway through being refurbished. Long contract, lots of payment milestones, couldn't pay the builder. We had a transformation project, an IT transformation project, which the key deliverables were the delivery of a new student record system and a new customer records management system. That was being led by PwC. Couldn't pay PwC. Couldn't pay Unit 4, the provider of our existing student record system. So we essentially categorized our critical contracts, and my category team contacted their account managers or their contacts within those suppliers and said, you know, that good relationship we spent years fostering, we now need to use some of the capital we've built up with you. And that was to come up with some plans to make certain those contracts continued, that even on a more base level, power continued to flow, and that students were able to rely on systems that would have naturally stopped had there not been some action taken by my team. 6 to 9 months on, where are we at the moment? We still have limited systems in some areas. Our intranet is not working as it should be. We've recovered all the pages, but they don't link together. We've still got several manual workarounds in places. So some of the low-level systems, and I don't know if many of you use Microsoft SharePoint, but that system was completely taken out, and it turned out that many of our finance-related processes were dependent on it. And we weren't able to recover that, so we had to put in manual processes overnight, and some of those are still in place now. We are transitioning to new systems, but that's been a very slow process. And of course, IT resource has been focusing on much higher priorities. So we are in a state now where I can talk about it coherently without starting to twitch. That was quite difficult for some time after the event. I would hesitate to use the word silver lining, but the learning curve has been almost vertical in terms of how we handled this. The business continuity plan has been put in stark context of reality, and I've certainly learned quite a bit in terms of what I would do in the event this happened again, God forbid, at the same organisation or indeed a later point in my career. That is a very quick summary of the practical impact, our response, and how I'm feeling now. I suspect Steve will dwell a little bit more on the human impact of this, given the fact that this takes its toll on your workforce in ways that nothing else ever has in my experience.
James, Emma. that was great. Thank you very much. I think Steve, as I say, we'll come to you for your comments. There's a couple of questions which I think will link into what you might be about to talk about, and those are what's in it for the hackers, why do they do it, and also sources of the cyber attack. Where does it come from? Can you pick up on that, as well as obviously what James has just commented on?
Yeah, of course, my favourite subject. So yeah, James makes a very good point about cyber insurance. I'd just like to make the point as well. Because you're all members of JISC and pay your subscription, you have direct access to our computer security incident response team as well. So don't forget that we're there. And James makes a very good point about sourcing a reputable incident response team. There are lists out there that you can access, but we also have a trusted introducer scheme where we can go straight to the list provided by the NCSC. But yeah, James is absolutely right. So moving on quickly, why do people do this? No longer really for fun, although some people will do that and exploring. Some of the newer hackers don't understand the unintended consequences of what they're doing. I'll quote a student that was late submitting a piece of work, thought he'd launch a DDoS attack, which he bought for £5 off the internet at his college. Unfortunately, it took down the entire infrastructure at the college, but worse than that, took down the local authority and the ambulance service. He didn't realise the consequences, so it was a very interesting chat. But mainly, we've seen for the ransomware attacks, it's been financial gain. It's as simple as that. It's criminal organisations. The National Cybersecurity Centre have issued say that most threats to universities are from cyber criminals who want to gain financial access. They'll either do this by traditional ransomware, or they will skim your web page and divert students or people's money into their accounts. They will do something called social engineering, where they will look at how people act and operate. And you heard Emma say earlier on, we noticed that for a while we were seeing attacks happen around about 7 o'clock on a Friday night because they knew we'd all gone home. Although my team were working 24/7. So there is this ongoing thing. There is a problem with nation states as well. They're what they call the big four in cybersecurity. So I will say this, so don't worry about this. It's Russia, it's China, it's Iran, and primarily North Korea. That doesn't exclude other countries and countries we would consider to be our friends and allies. You see attacks launched globally, really. But those big four are the most common ones. So Russian motivation obviously is mainly political, but with some economical interests. China, interesting enough, is more economical, where they're trying to gather information. The last two are more what we would call doing asymmetric attacks. They're launching all sorts of things, trying to find information, particularly from Iran. We see them trying to gather people's credentials so they can log on to systems and gain access to research material they wouldn't not necessarily have access to because of the way that they're viewed politically within the global area. Interesting enough, the World Economic Forum this year linked cybersecurity as their fourth highest risk globally. That's very interesting to see that, and it's nice to see that from my point of view, not good for the rest of you to see that. So I think that's answered the questions really, but it's important, as James was saying, the personal impact. So if you have a business continuity plan and you've tested it and it works, the one thing that I learned the hard way many years ago doing this is me and my team were during an incident, 18 hours in, we were still sat there trying to solve the problem. And to be honest, we were probably making ineffectual decisions. You need to make sure that you look at your people, not just feeding and watering, but taking care. And during all the ransomware attacks we've seen this year, working with institutions, working with my own team, I've spent a lot of time in the military, and I started to recognize what I would start to see indications of stress or even post-traumatic stress. Just remember the human impact. And it's not just the techies. I'm sure James won't mind me saying, James probably felt the stress and the burden of doing this. I suspect when you go home, I know when I go home, I'd probably power nap for an hour and I'd get up and checking things, bad habits. It's just taking time. Make sure that there's people that can talk to, whether it's the procurement people or the finance. Everybody will need some help somewhere along the line. And it's okay to say, I need help. The answer is, if you're okay, is yeah, I'm fine, because you know it's not. And it's just time. Make people step away from the machines. I can't emphasize that enough. Just to view your people. So what else is there to think about here when we're talking about incident responses? I saw one of the things flick past about concerns GDPR. Obviously, if you think you've had a breach in data, the other thing to consider is if you've lost data or you can't access it or you think it's gone missing, you're going to have to notify the ICO within 72 hours. Or if you notify students or anybody outside that, you've got to notify the ICO. So bear that in mind. It's an important factor when you're doing this. But this should form part of your business continuity plan and where you step. And hopefully you've got, well, I know you will have some good data protection people in there that have this in their area. Make sure that they're involved and they know what the process is and how that goes on. Other things to think about, you may need to notify the relevant authorities, whether that's Action Fraud, who you can log this. They'll very helpfully give you a crime number and some other advice. Contact JISC, because we can then pull in help from the National Cybersecurity Centre's operational team, our own team. We can support you, we can provide information. And more importantly, if we see an attack trend occurring, we can notify all other members, higher education, further education and research institutions we've seen a particular type of attack vector. I saw somebody ask how they're getting in. The most common threat that we saw during lockdown briefly was people obviously were working from home. You needed secure access. VPNs were a very short supply at that time. We noticed people opening up something called remote desktop protocol. This is when you have a problem with your PC and your IT man will say, let me log on and I'll fix it. So you can open that up and allow two-way conversations. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not really a very secure way of doing it. But we noticed that a lot of people hadn't patched or tested that system securely, and people were getting in through that back information and accessing systems. And the problem is, as some of you will know, have experienced this, is once they're in your system, we call it moving east-west. So once they get into your platform, they'll move left to right through every single system, as explained by James. And also we found something to be wary and careful of is whilst you think they've blocked all your stuff, we have found in probably 90% of all the instances we've dealt with ransomware, they remain active in your system monitoring what's going on. So as James says, it takes a while to get rid of them. We think between 10 and 20 days to recover, give or take. But as James explained, that long run after the recovery process is where the time takes. To put it in context of cost quickly, because I'll move on in a minute, we see an average attack costing around about £2 million. However, it's public knowledge that Redcar and Cleveland Council experienced a similar style of ransomware attack. Initially, their first costs were 10 million, and they're negotiating that about that's £8 million. And if you can think of a local authority, it probably equates to a smaller higher education or a large FE institution. And a lot of that was from IT rebuild. My final thing on this is, as James said, restoring information. Make sure you take backups, or not you, but make sure you guys have backups. You have alternative ways to access your information, and that your backups are actually kept in a secure location away from areas. Now, these are technical questions, and apologies to any technical colleagues on here, but it's good to have colleagues from procurement, the finance world, asking these questions, because I'm going to go back to my original thing. This is not just an IT problem, and it's not a security problem. It's a business risk problem. I'll stop there.
That's perfect timing, Steve. Thank you. So I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things. Both of you have mentioned business continuity plans. So just in the chat, I've just posted a question to the audience. Do you have a business continuity plan? Do you know what your responsibility is? Have you tested it? Just your comments and thoughts on that, please. Phil, I'm going to come to you in one moment, but I just wanted to ask James very quickly about you mentioned at the start of your presentation about having the right people in the conversations. Do you have kind of a heads up of who are the right people, or is that going to differ from institution to institution?
Yeah, but it will depend on what the leadership team is, or how it's structured, in all honesty. But typically this will go right to the top. So within higher education, the Vice Chancellor is heavily involved, and the technical experts will be that long forgotten individual who will have a title, something along the lines of cybersecurity. If you're fortunate enough to have a team, then that's great. We had single individual, and the director of IT. It wasn't so much identifying who was going to be involved, in all honesty, because I think to an extent that's reasonably straightforward. It's how they communicate, and where they get their information from. And the nature of a cyber attack will make a leadership team naturally cautious, because it feels bad. It feels bad that your systems have been breached. You are unlikely to share this with your own organization quickly. And then you've also got the potential of the media reporting if the information comes out. So different organizations determine different comms strategies, and therefore the director of external relations or marketing is also an important part of that conversation. I mean, some organizations, as you've seen, has almost told the BBC, and there's been an article there. Others have posted a note on their own website to say we are experiencing problems following a cyber attack. Others use language like incident and allow people to draw their own conclusions, and others will not tell anyone voluntarily. And again, senior leaders are reluctant to go to their peers in other organisations to say, how did you handle it? And some of the work that we've done is try, and the reason why I'm here today is to try and encourage those conversations within the sector. And it's something that traditionally people don't want to articulate or share. But it's been a learning experience, as I've said, and it was fundamental, I think, to how we responded, or the culture and the way that we responded. And it worked. It worked. In hindsight, it could have gone a lot worse. But again, these are things, although the incident responders are technical in nature, and again, they will analyze how many servers have been infected. They will recommend some technical solutions. They are people. They have been there before, and they do have discussions about how to manage comms within the organization, and they were helpful.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, so in the chat, we've just had a few comments there. Most have a policy, a plan. There's one person doesn't. I'm not sure about how many times they're tested. Phil, how important is this for insurance companies, and what kind of difference does it make to you when you're talking to an organisation about policies and how you can support them?
Yeah, so I think cyber insurance, and what we call it cyber and data protection insurance, and the reason for that, to reiterate what both James and Steve has said, is that this isn't about your IT systems. It's partly about that, but it's actually around data and data protection. Now, if you think about the origins of insurance, if you think back to the sort of 16th, 17th century, what it was about protection of assets. It was about ships that were doing trading. Then in the Industrial Revolution, that evolved into the buildings, factories. Those were the things that needed to be in place to be able to make things, and the machinery that went with that. In the 20th century, that evolved into the rise of employers' liability, as people realised that actually it was the workforce that was one of the most valuable assets. You needed the workforce to be able to make your business or your institution thrive. In the 21st century, I think people now appreciate, particularly in a post-pandemic world, that actually it's the information security and data protection systems that are really valuable. If you're doing a really important piece of research, clinical research, for example, and just to reiterate that point that Steve made, we saw a big increase in hacking events through the pandemic as third-party actors tried to find out some of that sort of pandemic research. These are the sources of value now within institutions. I said, if the pandemic has shown us anything, is that actually, do we need buildings to educate our students? I'm sure we do, and they clearly have a role to play going forward. But in a hybrid learning environment, information systems are really, really important. And therefore, we've seen the rise in the last few years of what we call cyber and data protection insurance. And it's quite an interesting evolution of insurance, which you don't hear too much interesting in insurance in the same phrase. But it is quite interesting in that it does this first party piece, which is the fire brigade, really. Your building is on fire. What are you going to do? And the breach response piece is your fire brigade. It's the IT response, it's the legal response, it's the PR and media response. It's all of those costs that go with that. So it's your bat phone, really, for when you've had that data breach incident, to be able to respond and give the right response, to disable what was happening in your IT systems, as Steve mentioned, to make that notification to the ICO. And there's a huge amount, actually, in terms of that breach response piece in a post-GDPR world. For example, all data subjects that have been impacted need to be notified, and that needs to be done often through a letter. So just the cost of sending letters out can be substantial. But it's that whole fire brigade piece. And then bolted onto that as well is the third party element. So if anybody brings an action against the institution for breaches in their security, which, you know, again, in a post-GDPR world, people are not shy of making those claims. We've seen some big data losses across institutions, not just in the HE world, but in the corporate world too. British Airways, Marriott Hotels, and, you know, there are law firms now that ride on the back of that. In a sort of a no-win, no-fee scenario. Have you been impacted by this? You can make a claim for breach of your data and third-party action. So the insurance also does that legal defence costs and any awards made against the institutions.
That's really helpful, thank you. I particularly like the reference to the fire brigade and the bat phone, which I don't think I've heard in any other presentations, but quite right, isn't it? So just an easy question for the audience again. Do you know how much your cyber and data insurance costs? So I'm not looking for costs, just a yes/no answer. Do you have an idea about how much it actually costs, or do we need to do some work on that in organisations? The first one's a no. Okay, no idea. A couple of yeses, a couple of no's. So mixed, I think, is the response at the moment. James, is it worth the money?
Depends on your perspective. Well, first of all, Steve alluded some time ago to the average cost of an incident like this running into the millions, and that's in line with our experience. If you take it up a level, and you look to see how much it will cost to source an incident responder, because initially, when you're hit with something like this, all you're interested in is coordinating a technical response. So you stop it, whatever it is, you contain it, and you get some specialist expertise analysing what happens if you, for example, try to access files that have been encrypted. Now, that in itself is a service that you're looking to pay £120,000, £125,000 minimum. Cyber insurance, less than half of that, even if you end up not taking the cheapest policy you can find. So from a financial perspective, you're talking relatively low sums of money, and it's a no-brainer. Slightly longer term, the policies come with a whole bunch of other provisions as well: consultancy, kits, overtime, lots of other what you might describe as indirect losses. I mean, and yeah, absolutely, you need to collect evidence of this additional expenditure, and trying to claim off any insurance policy, regardless of what it's for, is tricky, because the insurance will push back and say, you didn't minimise your loss, this isn't covered, and so on. So you need to make certain that evidence is collated. But absolutely, the policy does provide for that. Obviously, there are excesses as well. But in terms of whether it's worth the money, in hindsight, from a procurement perspective, it's a no-brainer.
Brilliant.
Can I make 2 points on that, Emma? Is that okay?
Absolutely. I was going to come to you next, actually.
So I think, firstly, it's understanding that the market is changing here. And I've seen some comments in the chat around cost changing. Because we are seeing more institutions buying this cover, it means that there are more claims, but the claims have increased. So, just the basic data about the numbers of ransomware attacks, as we referenced, are increasing. And that means that the cost of insurance is increasing. And as I said, I've seen some comments on that, and that isn't something we can ignore, because the loss ratios, in effect, the last analysis I think our brokers did was that the loss ratios across cyber in the last 12 months were in the region of 140 to 150%, which means that insurers have lost money, effectively, by providing this cover. As this evolves, as the market evolves, and this is a relatively new area of insurance, we will see some stabilisation of pricing. But the other point that we'll make is that the second point I want to make is around the risk protections. And increasingly, insurers are asking for evidence of risk protections, in the same way as if you built a building out of timber and didn't put any alarms or fire protections in place, the insurers would say, we don't want to insure this. They are completely entitled to say that. If you don't have basic risk protections in place, insurers will not provide the cover for cyber and data protection insurance. So aspects like multi-factor authentication, remote RDPs that Steve mentioned, endpoint detection and response, EDR, all of these aspects will see some driving into more detail. And in the same way as most institutions on this call will have theft insurance in place, but they'll still have their buildings alarmed and secured, it's the same approach on your information security systems.
Great, thanks, Phil. Actually, Steve, if you can pick up a bit more in depth in that as well, that would be great on some of the data side and the systems side, sorry, that people can focus on.
Yeah, I think James and Phil have made some very good points there, and I would like to make out the point that this is not a modern phenomenon. Cybersecurity and information security has been going on for years. I mean, quickly, I've been doing this for over 40 plus years. I started off as a very young serviceman in the Royal Air Force, training electronic warfare and cryptography. It's not a new phenomenon. In fact, if you go far back to the 60s, a guy called Wallace Ware stated that if you connect two computer systems together, you'll have a security risk. And he's the guy that invented, worked on ARPANET, DARPANET in the early days of the internet. And he's actually the guy that set up the first call for Nixon with the Chinese and the security. It's not a new phenomenon. It's still going on. So coming into the protection and what you can do outside of having discussed about reactive plans and business continuity and stuff, Phil mentioned my favorite thing, multi-factor authentication, or MFA, you'll hear it called. It can feel onerous and burdensome when you first set it up, and the techies will probably shudder. But once you've got it in place, basically multi-factor authentication means that you put your password in as normal, and then it will ask you to authenticate through a separate device. So this can be through an authenticator on your mobile, you can't see that, but on my mobile phone or your mobile phone. It can be biometrics, it can be a thumbprint, it can be a facial recognition. And this shouldn't just be at work. You should do this in your home life as well with your mobile phones. It's very, very important you do this, because if somebody does brute force and accesses your password, they need to have that second check. So it's extra layer of protection. That's probably one of the most simplest things you can go back to your IT team and ask them to do. Bearing in mind, you probably want to go with a coffee if that's their particular drink, just to have that chat. But that's really important. Also, I cannot emphasize this enough. Make sure that systems are patched to the appropriate release. Most of the patches come out not for functionality or so that the organization can charge you more money. It's usually to protect or overcome a vulnerability they have detected. So it's very important you have a strong patching regime. Other things, so your system administrators, even if in your finance systems, your procurement systems, make sure that you're not sharing passwords. Or only the people that need to see that information have access to that information. I don't need to have access to the procurement system. Sue Weston would kill me if I accessed it. But I don't need to have access. They're there. That whole team support that function. Limit access to your information. Make sure it's protected. Make sure it's properly done. I've mentioned this once before, and I'm going to mention it again. Your backups are key to your business continuity plan. No data backup, not kept securely. No restoration. James mentioned about SharePoint and the impact that had. You need to make sure that your teams are protecting that. Another area of vulnerability is something called your Active Directory. This is in the Microsoft stuff. This is where everything goes through and is controlled. Make sure that is done. There's a whole raft. I'm not going to go into there, but just go back, and really the most simplest thing you can put in place at the moment is multi-factor authentication.
Steve, there's a question in the chat actually saying, is MFA mandatory? And I suspect if we talk to Phil and yourself, I wonder if we might get different answers. But
James wanted to comment, I think.
Do you want to, pick up on that?
Yeah, it's probably worth just picking up before we go on to that, if that's okay, because we're getting into practical things you can do, which are all very valuable. But I think the initial query was about sourcing a cyber policy. Phil went through the kind of information that is required when you source this kind of thing. And bearing in mind, we've done this less than a year or so ago. All right, so there is absolutely no shadow of a doubt that the extent of information that insurers require these days, from a technical point of view, is increasing. Is it really arduous? Not really. And our head of IT was engaged at that point. And again, this is obviously pre-incident. But there was about a 3 or 4 page document that covered things like Steve is talking about, multi-factor authentication. There were some things there that we had to go and find out. But was it particularly onerous compared to the information you provide a broker or an insurer before they agree to insure you for something else? Not extensively. That is changing. And I'm sure Phil would agree that actually this has been a very fast moving thing over the last 12 months or so. And the extent of information is that's being requested is increasing. and there are increasing number of incidents where insurance is being refused. I think that's true as well. Just to pick up on a point that Greg mentioned in the chat, which I think is really important to mention, is talking about whether or not insurance policies cover ransomware. The attack that we had was ransomware, and the policy that we'd had, we bought actually included paying the ransom. Now, that is contentious. It's contentious for a couple of reasons. But the main one, and pretty obvious one, is that if a policy encourages an organisation to take action that in turn creates increased criminal activity, then they could be in breach, and that might not be considered strictly legal. Now, that might well be changing. And if I were to buy the policy today, I don't know whether that provision would be provided. And that's something I'm sure Phil can comment on. But I thought that was a really good point, because, again, during that initial aftermath, all options are considered by leadership, including, well, what exactly is it that our policy covers us for? There's a whole policy on ransom, right? So paying it is on the table, and it's just really important that we understand whether or not things are changing in that regard. So.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. I think just to confirm, the insurance policies as they're written, these are commercial insurance policies, and they do indemnify the payment of ransomware. Ultimately, that is a decision for the institution to take. There was a really interesting article. I'll send through a link to you, Emma, an article in the Observer 3 or 4 weeks ago around cyber attacks, and they referenced two institutions. One was a hospital group in the US, and another one was a London-based local authority. One, the American hospital group paid the ransomware, and they were very open about it and why they did it. The London-based local authority did not do that. They went through a lot of pain through that, but ultimately that was the institution's decision to do that. The government position will always be don't pay it. But there's a commercial decision that needs to be taken here. If that is the best path for you to reinvigorate in your systems, then that needs to be a commercial decision. There are alternative paths, and some of the insurance policies, interestingly, are evolving again. So actually scrapping systems and starting over. So there's a new clause. Some policies have got what's called a bricking clause. So actually, if it's cheaper or if it's more valuable to actually do away with all of your hardware and basically start again from scratch, that can be an option for you. So the insurance policies will develop and evolve as people's attitude and governments and institutions approach to this changes.
Can I just, I would never advocate paying ransomware, even if it's an option. Several reasons behind this. As James has said, the UK government are looking at this to see whether that's actually going to be in breach of various regulations or actually potentially a criminal act. Secondly, historically and within the sector, we have seen that just by paying the ransomware and unlocking your stuff does not remove the people from your systems. And the American institutions, most of them within 1 month have suffered the ransomware attacks. But James and Philip see it from just, and it may be your last resort and it is a business decision. However, if you're going to do that, you need to be really, really clear that you have got everybody out of your system, because you'll go down again. And we've actually seen attacks changing the way that they're doing this. So we've now seen them coming in, applying ransomware, watching the defensive capabilities kick into place from the on-site team, my team, and the insurers. So they're coming back in and exfiltrating, taking away the data, and completely erasing all the systems on the institution. So you have nothing now to restore.
And that's where the breach response is very valuable, actually, because because these people are so involved, they understand the criminal actors involved. They know, they can almost tell the difference between the different teams or the different criminal gangs or groups, and advise as to what their sort of trading interaction is, and advise you as to whether it is something you should further engage with, and again give you that advice is that if you're going to go down that path, any break is completely clean.
Yeah, and Phil made another good point actually about the rebuild and rebuilding systems. From our experience, and I think James mentioned this in his early introduction, most organizations actually undergo a comprehensive rebuild of their existing architecture and infrastructure. They're removing all the old legacy kit that people have held on to a little bit maybe beyond life. There's been a mass move to cloud. Cloud vendors have stepped up their security protocols as well. And it's just looking at how if the IT infrastructure has evolved across campuses, and that's a very important thing. And also one thing that we haven't talked about, and I'm desperately trying not to go down the technical rabbit hole. I promised Emma I wouldn't, but there's something called a flat subnet. So your network all exists on one layer, which makes it so easy for the threat actors to run rampant through all the pieces. You need to have some segregation. You probably all have heard somewhere on the line something called a firewall. They're important, but also something called basically a fire break. You need to put a fire break in. If you're forest, you have a fire break, stop fire. You need to put breaks, DMZs they're called in technical terms, between your platforms and infrastructure so they're isolated. If one person accesses one piece, they don't take it out. But this is where Phil and James are talking about insurance policies. How do you get there? About the scope. It's understanding what you've got covered. It's understanding what protection you have. It's a bit like Phil mentioned about fire, a bit like your cars. You've got alarms, you've got immobilizers, it's on a drive, it's in a garage. There's a whole list of things there. And the good thing about this, I saw a question come up. I'm going to pick this up if you want, if I may, Emma, about Cyber Essentials Plus. It's not the panacea for all ills, but it is a very good process for establishing what your protective measures are, where you are in your cyber maturity. It will help people like Phil and insurers when they come in. So you can say, we have achieved this certification, we have achieved this point. I think the question was, yes, you're right. I think if you're bidding for public sector contracts, you now need to have Cyber Essentials as a minimum, if not Cyber Essentials Plus. It starts you down that journey. It's an annual thing. So you have to do it every year. We've stepped up. We can do this with members. That's not a sale. We can do this. Other people can. But we're also working with the National Cyber Security Centre and IASME to see how we can help them evolve this, because it's designed for small businesses or large businesses. It doesn't necessarily tailor very well to our world. So we're working with them. But I think it is important. It's a bit like your car MOT. For the moment you've done it, it's valid until you drive, but you keep going. And once you get it into your conversations with your teams, it becomes part of business as usual. There are other regulatory things you can do. There's ISO 27000, there's BS31. There's a whole raft of these things. But if you're going to do something, even if you want to see how your organization is doing, Cyber Essentials is a very good step to do that and just to quantify. And it probably make Phil's teams a lot easier if you come in and say, we've got Cyber Essentials Plus, and we're working potentially to any other of the compliance regulatory standards out there. Even just having a look at ITIL, that will help you in some of the ways, because you're developing the processes, whether it's service management. But there's a whole lot of things in there. Just one thing in GDPR as well, it does mention, I think it's clause 29, that you must take all, I'll confirm that, but I think it's 29. You must take all due care and attention, protect your hardware and assets that the data transits upon. And people forget that, and they just think about the data. It's very important that you go back to that point. But yeah, I just wanted to come in and touch that point there about Cyber Essentials. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing, and it does highlight issues. You can do other things. You can have pen testing done. There's a whole raft of other things you can do. I don't want to go down that because that sets a whole list of different things. But if you're going to go back and talk to your senior leadership team, ask them, have we thought about doing Cyber Essentials? If not, why not?
Great. Thanks, Steve. James or Phil, anything to add on Cyber Essentials?
I think the only bit it's constantly updating insurers about what happens and what risk protections are in place. We've done that with Cyber Essentials, but as that evolves, it's just making sure that they have a really good understanding of the positive impact that has on your information security management.
Great, thanks, Phil.
Nothing huge from me on that, and I have to say my experience with Cyber Essentials has been in the context that Steve referred to when bidding for public contracts, so apprenticeships, for example. It can actually preclude you from doing so now if you don't have Cyber Essentials. So there's two reasons for organisations to consider accreditation there.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. So throughout this, we've referred to different functions in an organisation and what they do and what they bring to the party if this actually happens. So just for the audience, another question going in the chat there. Who do you think holds responsibility for cyber risk? I think we've identified it's not just IT, but whose job is it? Just see what everybody thinks about that. Any thoughts at all? Steve, aha, here we go. Senior team, everyone's responsibility, the executive, every single person, every director at head, the board, governance management, everyone's. I think that might be hitting the nail on the head. Steve, do you want to address that?
Yeah, I think everyone is absolutely right. Top down, bottom up. Those of you who've seen me present before, I'm very much of the opinion there are no stupid questions in cyber and information security to start with. If you need to know, ask. I get very cross when people in my world pretend it's a big secret and won't talk about it openly. There is absolutely no reason why that cannot happen. Obviously, you don't want to discuss if you're in the middle of a breach. There are other things, but you should be able to go and ask that question. You should be able to go and ask VC, registrars, chancellors. You'd be able to go and ask them a simple question. You know, what is your view on cyber and information security risks for our organization? There are many training things you can do to do this. You know, the NCSC have a board toolkit and they do board training. I've put the GISC board through this. Didn't make me popular, but they come out of it and know I have direct access to the GISC board and the senior leadership team at any time to talk about this, and that's something you need to place. But actually, it's everybody's responsibility, even down to I'll call it an administration role. If they see phishing, reporting it, checking, understanding risk, training. We haven't discussed training yet, but I think training and awareness is probably one of the other really good things you can do just to raise awareness. What to do if you see what you think is a dodgy email. You know, what do you do? Ask that question. You know, can you report it? There are things in Microsoft you can report phishing. You can do lots of other things. Phishing training is good. I'm not always a good advocate of it, but understanding how to recognize what a dodgy email header looks like or an address. You know, behaviors. I mentioned social engineering before, very clever term for just understanding what people do. If I make regular payments or do things, or any of you guys make, and all of a sudden you start seeing that happening out of hours or odd times, James might try and buy something when he doesn't normally do things. You know, challenging, ask the question. If James is doing that legitimate, he's not going to be upset. Sorry, James, I don't mean to pick on you, but if James is doing that, it's legitimate. If I do something out of hours and somebody phones me, I'm not going to be upset. I'm going to be really pleased that somebody's noticed what I'm doing, and two, they're actually on the ball and have enough with them. So that's something else you need to do. But it is everybody's responsibility. Within my team, we have regular updates, information. It's very hard to keep it fresh and not boring because, you know, unless you're me, you're not going to love this subject. But it's how to do that, and it should just be a general conversation. It should be part of every monthly briefing. You know, it should be on the board agenda. It should be on the senior leadership team's agenda. And looking at it from a risk perspective, because it is a risk. But everybody needs to understand the risk, the reputational damage this can cause, and what role they have to play. Everybody has a role to play in this. It's not just the incident response guys getting under the hood, so to speak, and ripping routers and stuff apart, trying to find out what's going on and reading long lists of code. You know, we love doing that, but that's not what it's about, really. It's about, you know, how do you make sure that your institution is safe, you provide a safe online learning environment for your students and everything else. Everybody's, even students and learners coming on, they need to be aware of you know, how they can protect themselves, what they can do. You know, it's a big thing. If I had my way, I'd be teaching them in reception classes and bringing it up. Probably not the way to do it, but yeah, it's just understanding the training. Everybody's responsibility. Can't emphasize that enough.
And I think Helen Baker's just sent something saying at least it went to junk, but the reminder, I guess, that we have all kinds of communications coming from what look like very valid authorized organizations, and you know, there are lots of ways, I think, and Steve, you'll correct me here, lots of ways that the hackers get in, not always via an email, but that is often the first way that normal people will see that.
Well, just to put that into context, my team's record for gaining access to an institution and getting into their Active Directory is less than 10 minutes, and that's actually gaining access through the front door. And that's not booked on, not having any credentials. That's walking up to the reception, chatting to the receptionist, and then tailgating somebody through and working their way through into the institution till they can find a terminal they can get onto. So that's 10 minutes. That's not always the case, and these are very good guys. This is what they're trained to do. You know, this is what they do day in, day out. So it's not, but it's just be aware that it doesn't have to be an electronic attack either.
Yeah,
it's the person that comes in that could be, you know, if the BT guy's running around your institution or in somewhere, should he be there? Like I said, if he's got a pass, ask. You wouldn't not let anybody into your house at home saying, "I'm British Gas." You'd ask for their pass or what. You know, you apply that thinking at work, really.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I would really endorse the point that Steve makes there on training, Emma. And coming back to my previous analogies about protecting assets, we're all used now to undertaking health and safety training. We all have fire evacuation training, don't we? We all exit the building twice a year, so we know what we're doing if there's a fire in place. Training, coming back to this point about what insurers are asking for, they are asking for evidence of social engineering training, phishing training. We have to do it as part of our job within Gallagher's. We have to do cyber security training in the same way as we have to evidence our training for our FCA registration. So it should be part of day-to-day life. But it's like with anything within risk, it's the culture. And if it comes from the top, and we see it across rafts of risks within HEIs on aspects like travel, you know, if it's integrated from the top, if it's coming from the VC level that you need to be doing travel risk assessments before you go to dangerous areas of the world, it becomes embedded in day-to-day working, and it should be the same with cyber.
I agree. I think that latter point you make, Phil, is absolutely fundamental. And again, yes, absolutely, it's everybody's responsibility to take some or to make certain that they are aware of what they need to do in order to minimize risk. However, it very much depends on where the most top levels risk register or responsibility for it resides within an organization. And if you have a top level risk register that gets reviewed by your executive leadership regularly, there's absolutely no reason why cyber risk should not now be on it. And that in turn should drive action that Phil was talking about in terms of the delivery of training. So director of HR, some kinds of mitigating actions. Steve referred to backups and technical solutions. So the CIOs should be part of that mitigating or that mitigation against the high level risk. I think it extremely unlikely that anyone who has a cyber attack on their risk register ever close it, or will ever be green, and that in turn drives the conversation throughout. Let's face it, a senior group within an organisation who may not be particularly au fait with the market or even computers, dare I say, in general. So there needs to be mechanisms and drivers in place to force that conversation, to make sure everybody does step up to the plate in the way that we've just said that they should.
Okay. Thank you. There's a couple of questions or points in the chat about pen testing. So I'm going to just lean on James and Steve, if that's okay. James, the question was, prior to the attack, had you had pen test? And Steve, you mentioned it, saying it can be useful. I wonder if you can just address when. Should we all be doing this? So over to you, James.
Steve, do you want to go first and just explain what it is?
Yeah, so it's important. Penetration testing. So the first thing I would say is the most important thing is to understand the scope of what you're trying to do. and what you're trying to test. And we spend a lot of time with our pen testing when we get engagement with a member to understand what's to be unknown. So penetration testing is really looking at your systems to see what is vulnerable, to see how far we can get without doing damage. It has another name called ethical hacking. I don't really like that. You might hear them called white hats. It's just not. It's guys that are trained to access systems. And I said, with that social engineering, you can agree, do you want us to try and access your systems? And then what we do, from my team's perspective, the teams that we run, we work alongside with some key people. So we tell them what's going on, or if they don't want to, we'll do an unannounced attack to see if they can detect it. But we'll go through, and attack is also not the right word, because what we're trying to do is probe and test defensive systems and see how far we can get. And as we sit alongside the IT teams, not all pen testing organizations do this, we'll be identifying all the risks. If we find a critical risk, we'll flag that straight away, because there's no good us going, oh yeah, we noticed that 3 days ago, oh, and now you've gone down. But also what we do is we help then do the restoration and the fix. And there's a very good comment in the chat about it's very useful because it gives you a to-do list for your security teams. Absolutely, and you can categorize that red, amber, green. So they're very valuable tools. It does help you define your security posture and your maturity, which will be helpful for the likes of Phil when they come in and say, have you had a pen test? Here's our pen test, but this is what we've done, and this is our strategy going forward. It helps build that flow. And like I say, you might find it called ethical hacking. There are loads of organizations out there just provide this, but also you can go, if you really want to go and find out, you can look at the National Cybersecurity website. They have a list of people in there. All I say is be careful what you're looking to do, understand what you want to test. You guys are procurement, you know this. There are also an awful lot of snake oil salesmen out there as well, so be very careful. Go to the look for the accreditation. So Crest Security, there's a whole raft of them that have to have badges and stuff. Make sure you check and get a reputable organization as well. That's the other thing I would say. I'm not saying that they're going to be anybody malicious out there, but it's the quality. So in procurement, you're used to checking, that it's fit for purpose, it meets the requirements and things like that. But I think the first thing you do, you can have a pen test, but you need to understand what you're testing. But very clearly in the comment, I think it's from Crispin, it gives you an excellent to-do list. You work through that. It should be done annually. That's not because I'm trying to generate business, but you need to check it. You can't just say, I've had a pen test. Look at that. It's great. We fixed it, because systems evolve, work practices evolve, new technology is deployed, old equipment becomes out of date or legacy. And it's, as was said earlier, it forms part of your senior leadership team's strategy, cascaded down through either whether the CIO to CTOs, CISOs, even down to the IT guys. It is a full function.
Okay. Yeah. Again, not too much to add. I will tackle the subject from a slightly different angle. And again, just looking at the language that Darren uses in his comment, and to an extent, language that Crispin mentioned or uses as well. There is a temptation here, because a cyber attack is scary. It feels worrying. That there is a temptation to think, right, if I do 1, 2, 3, we're not going to be attacked. Now, Steve has mentioned, backups. We have backups. Our backups are either infected or locked. We've got training. We've got training in the same way other organizations do. So there is no silver bullet that will prevent you from being attacked. That doesn't mean you shouldn't identify steps like penetration testing that form part of your constant and rolling awareness program. So that absolutely not is the answer to the question that Darren asked, is that, it wouldn't necessarily have stopped it. There is no single step that we could have taken that would have, or we've identified that would have prevented it. But, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a fruitless exercise. And I think it's quite important just to bear that in mind. These are not things that you're going to do in order to stop an attack.
I think James is very right there. This is how we call it defense in depth. And how you improve that. No one single thing will stop it. And I'm probably a bit infamous for saying it's not if, it's when you'll experience attack, but it's how you deal with that. And I think James makes a very valid point, and his experience is why he's talking to everybody and why we encourage people. It's what you do in that instance, it's sharing that knowledge, and be, the old Boy Scout me, be prepared. It is, and knowing what to do. I think James has made that point very eloquently today as well. So.
We'll share after this recording and the contact details of our speakers today, but I think Steve and Phil, both of you have mentioned various websites. I think Steve, you mentioned the National Cybersecurity website, and there's been some other acronyms.
I'll send
that I don't
a
know.
list of unabbreviated links and stuff for you to use, and I guarantee they are clean links.
Brilliant, and we'll share those afterwards. And if there's anything else, of course, coming out, we'll share that too. Just move on. I don't think we've got any more questions. So I'd just like to bring us towards a close, actually, and go to each person on the panel here and just say if there's one piece of succinct takeaway advice you would give to the audience, what would it be? Start with yourself, Steve.
Douglas Adams, don't panic, for those that like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think it's understanding your risk, be prepared, and know who to contact. Have a good contact plan when things do go dark, and also please don't forget your people.
Okay, and Phil?
Because I'm greedy, I'm going to ask for two, I think.
Well, that's fine.
The first one, I think, is about contextualizing cyber insurance, cyber and data protection insurance. It's been often sort of referenced as a nice to have. So we've renewed all our other policies. Have we got enough in the budget for cyber and data protection? Because the risk has changed and because the cost has changed, procurement from a procurement's perspective, we need to start the conversation very early and understand what is your insurance procurement strategy, because insurance buying can be very anachronistic. This is what we've used to be buying for the last 20 years. We're going to carry on doing that, and we're going to bolt some bits on the side if we need to. I suggest, in the next 12 months, because there's been so much change in the insurance market, it's really good. Start again with a clean piece of paper. Link in within your risk register. What risks does your institution have? And then match your insurance buying strategy to the risks you have within your institution. Your profiles have changed. Your risk profiles clearly have changed in the last 12, 18 months. Your insurance buying and procurement and structure strategy has changed also. You just don't know it. And so you need to get up to speed with that. Linked in with that, what I would say is a broker has a really important role to play. There are lots of different types of cyber and data protection policies. Some are good, some are indifferent, some are very poor. And a broker will help you walk through the differences on those policies. Very quick example, most institutions would have been impacted by the Blackboard incident last year. That is a third-party organisation holding data. Not all insurance policies indemnify the third parties that hold your data, but some do. And so understanding the differences between those is really, really important.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Phil. James?
I'll try and be as concise as possible and try and pick up on a different angle. Keep talking. This is not a mythical issue anymore. It happens. There are people within higher education up and down the country that have hard experience of dealing with this. Talk to your colleagues, talk to the purchasing consortia, LEPC members, make certain you're plugged into the ITSG, even if you're not a member of it. It's surprising the amount you pick up just by listening.
Absolutely.
I'll add, James, talk to your techies. We don't buy honest. I mean, Sue, I'm picking on Sue again, but Sue and I have regular catch-ups. I can go to any one of her team and they can come to any one of my team. Just engage with your techies because you're going to be one of the first people we come to in a crisis and vice versa. So
yeah, communication is key.